Buenos días de nuevo. Nuestro próximo invitado orador es Richard Mattison, que nos va a hablar de la importancia y significación del capital natural. Quizá un poco como rápida introducción a su intervención, se trataría un poco de cómo la sostenibilidad debe ser entendida en las empresas, que es una pregunta clave y sí inicialmente habría que enfocarla como solo una cuestión de responsabilidad ambiental o de una manera mucho más amplia y más estratégica como algo que afecta a la capacidad de la empresa para sobrevivir y prosperar a la vista de un cambiante y retador mundo. El coste total de hacer negocios no está, como sabemos todos los que estamos aquí o la mayoría, no está representado en los estados financieros. Si una empresa verdaderamente tuviera que pagar por sus impactos sobre el capital natural, pues la primera pregunta, ¿qué costaría ello? ¿Cómo afectaría a su rentabilidad? Y alguna otra pregunta más, sin duda. Los costes ambientales representan, como sabéis, un riesgo, pero especialmente representan una oportunidad. Richard Mattison es el consejero delegado de Trucost, que es una empresa proveedora de información e investigación en el campo de la eficiencia ambiental de los negocios. Ha estado dando apoyo a compañías, inversores, gobiernos, universidades y a los líderes de vanguardia del mundo empresarial y político para entender realmente las consecuencias económicas del capital natural. Y lo lleva haciendo durante 12 años. Ha asesorado, Richard, varios cuerpos de Naciones Unidas y gobiernos sobre medio ambiente y sobre servicio de los ecosistemas. Y ha liderado proyectos muy innovadores, incluyendo todo lo relacionado con los beneficios ambientales y las cuentas de pérdidas y resultados, especialmente en una conocida firma deportiva como es Puma. Y ha valorado las externalidades de más de 3.000 grandes compañías, bajo el principio de inversión responsable de Naciones Unidas. Richard es también asesor de la iniciativa de Global Reporting Initiative y de TIP, el proyecto que conocéis la mayoría sobre la economía de los ecosistemas y la biodiversidad, y también es colaborador en premios del Guardian sobre negocios sostenibles. Ha estudiado en la Universidad de Edimburgo, ha sido responsable de importantes responsabilidades senior, es neurobiólogo, en inglés neuroscientist, y tiene un doctorado en neuroscience de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Y sin más circunloquio, I give the floor to Richard Mattison, and thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's my great pleasure to be here in Madrid today, where you still have summertime, unlike in the UK, where we are now in wintertime. So you're very lucky, as am I, to be here. Today I'm going to talk about two aspects. I'm going to talk about a report that we did for a UN-sponsored body called the TEEB Initiative, that stands for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And actually I'm also going to talk about why this is relevant for businesses and the kind of work that we do with our clients and how they generate value from understanding natural capital risks and opportunities. So we were asked by this initiative, which is an initiative that was sponsored by the G7 nations, G8 nations actually, at Potsdam in 2007, to analyze the economics of natural capital, of ecosystems and biodiversity. And in this particular case, what we were asked to examine were the top 100 risks to businesses globally. So this is for all business sectors, for all different countries, for all types of environmental impacts and dependencies on natural capital. We actually had to analyze 10,000 different types of risk and opportunity, and we distilled that down to the top 100. And I'll talk through the results of that as I go through the presentation. But first, what I'd like to do is to reiterate the points that have been made earlier on so eloquently about natural capital and the fact that natural capital is really the foundation for all of the other forms of capital that we as people and the global economy rely on. And I wanted to give you a very small example to make that tangible. If we look at things like forests, you can understand that forests, for example, create value through a lot of different things, through tourism, through the absorption of carbon dioxide emissions, through purification of air in other ways, various different things. But sometimes to business people, it's a little bit intangible. That's surely something that governments should have to worry about. And I would disagree. But if I want to make this really tangible, what I would say is that let's take the example of water. Now, we assume that water today, most business people would assume that water, you pay for water, it has a price, and therefore, what is the problem? Well, actually, if you look at the price of water globally, there is a negative correlation between the price of water and how scarce that water is, which is the reason why the 10 provinces in China that create most of China's exports are called the dry 10. They're the driest provinces in China. And that's the reason why China has had to invest $65 billion on a water pipeline. So really what we're talking about there is a market failure to recognize the value of water, because water is scarce in certain places in the world and the pricing does not recognize that scarcity. Mining companies, for example, as part of their license to operate, may not have to pay for water at all. But I would see that as a risk. If you're not paying for water at all, that would be a business risk that you should recognize in your net present value calculations. And I'll go on to talk about why. In a macroeconomic sense, I can understand at the moment why businesses are actually quite excited. We seem to be globally coming out of a recession. I don't want to prejudice the global economy on the basis of saying that, but there are some early growth signs. And if you look between now and 2030, so in the next 17 years, there will be 3 billion more middle-class consumers in the world, mostly in emerging markets. And that presents a huge growth opportunity for most CEOs. Most CEOs that I talk to would say that is where their focus is on growth. However, over that same time period, between now and 2030, we will face a shortfall of water by 40%. So something has got to give, as you would say in America. We cannot sustain our current business as usual business model with the resource availability that we have and satisfy that demand. And I'm hopeful because I think we have some answers and we have some solutions, which I'll talk through. So that's kind of about the next 17 years. And if I said, let's face it, most CEOs would be thinking the next 3 or 4 years. Next 17 years is the next person's problem. Actually, it's also today's problem. So why now? Well, if you don't believe me when I say it is today's problem, believe the top CEOs of multinational companies globally who assemble at Davos every year at the World Economic Forum. And at the World Economic Forum, they create a report every year called the Global Risks Report. This is about all risks. This is about huge amount of socioeconomic risks, technology risks, and environmental risks. And you can't really see what that graph says, but the axes along the bottom, it says the likelihood to occur in the next 10 years and the impact if the risk were to occur. And what I'll do is I'll highlight the top right-hand corner, which shows the top risks. That corner there, on this slide here. So what you see actually is that these risks are actually all linked to natural capital. And if I expand on that argument, rising greenhouse gases will be, as a consequence of failure of climate adaptation, will create water supply crises, and we're already seeing an elevated level of commodity prices that is vastly above the levels we experienced in the last century, and more volatility. And we'll see extreme volatility in energy and agricultural prices, which will create food shortage crises. And severe income disparity will create some of these other issues as well. So when I say why now, what I'd like to do is propose a hypothesis. I'm not going to say this is my hypothesis, but I'm going to just show you why this has already happened, these risks. This is not something we have to worry about in the future. These risks have already come to bear. What if I said that the Arab Spring was actually caused by a natural capital shock? So most people, when I say that, would say, well, that's ridiculous. But if I expand, China in 2010, East China had experienced a severe drought. And China, normally speaking, does not export or import wheat. It's the world's biggest market for wheat, but it doesn't import or export because it grows enough for itself. However, when it experiences a drought, it suddenly needs to export, and it's called a swing in the commodity markets, which increases the price for wheat. Russia, at the same time, had a massive drought, and President Putin, stopped exporting wheat. So actually what happened, because of those two effects, both caused by water, the price of wheat went up by 150%. So what's the price of wheat got to do with Arab nations? Well, Arab nations are, of the top 10 importers of wheat, 9 of those are Arab nations. And also, when the price of wheat goes up, the price of food goes up, because 6.5 kilograms of wheat go in as a food stock to 1 kilogram of beef on average. So the price of food doubled. And in this country, you might spend between 5 and 10% of your income on food. But in the Arab nations at the time, that figure was more like 40 to 50% of your income spent on food. So the price of food doubles. You really cannot afford to feed your family. Couple that with socio-economic unrest in those nations, and social media, and that's why some people say the Arab Spring was actually triggered by droughts. So I mention this only to say, in a business context, that water is actually critical, because we all operate in a global market that's interconnected. Our supply chains are globalized and very complicated and hard to untangle. We all rely on commodity markets, and these commodity markets are being driven in ways that don't currently recognize risk, because water is not correctly priced. And so that is one small element of natural capital and why we need to price natural capital. And to go on then and talk about how that actually affects companies, well, we've seen already many companies report profit warnings to their investors as a consequence of some of these risks that I just mentioned. You've seen clothing companies report a drop in profitability because of an increase in the cost of cotton caused by cotton production being severely affected by droughts. And there are numerous other examples where share prices have been affected today. This is, again, not in the future. This is today, and over the last 2 years, by issues to do with natural capital, which actually sit beneath the increase of commodity prices and the availability of natural resources. And if you add on top of that the fact that regulators will have to act as resources become more scarce, you have to regulate so that you can allocate resources in a fair way. You have to provide some fairness between the water you give to a mining company versus the water you give to your farmers versus the water you give to your people. So regulators will have to act when resources become scarce. So these all present risks. So this is the reason really why we did this report with the United Nations and with the TEEB for Business Coalition. And so we studied the top 100 externalities. And let me just explain exactly what we looked at. We looked at what would happen if water were priced accurately and other resources that we rely on. So that would be natural capital. We also looked at what would happen if pollution was paid for by the companies that created that pollution. So what would happen to profit if the companies actually had to pay for that pollution? We looked across the whole global economy. It was a very ambitious study. And we looked at 5 different broad environmental areas. And I should say right up front, there are some limitations to the accuracy of this study. It was a huge task to undertake this. But we did it because we feel it's important to do. Just because something is uncertain doesn't mean you shouldn't analyze it. In fact, all the more reason to analyze it. And if I just examine how we actually went through the process of quantifying in financial terms what is an environmental risk, let me take air pollution. So in China today, air pollution by our calculations costs China 10% of their GDP. So that is 10% of their economic flow. So we're actually, in that case, analyzing economic flows. And in this particular situation for air pollution, you can quantify that quite firmly. Why? Because the air pollution created largely by industry in China creates healthcare cost. People die younger, on average 5 years younger than the rest of China. In the north of China, your life expectancy is 5 years less than in the rest of China. And then in the north of China, that is where the air pollution is most heavily concentrated. And that's a study recently launched by the Chinese government itself. It also affects crops. So crop yields reduced by 15%. It affects timber. It affects corrosion of buildings and other types of infrastructure through acid rain. And you also get acidification of the waterways so that your water sources are less productive from the perspective of fishing. So all of that actually stacks up and has an economic consequence on the Chinese economy. And my question would be, what would happen, therefore, if the companies had to pay for the pollution? And actually, that is precisely what we're currently helping the Chinese government think about today. So this is what we examined globally as one of the issues. And as I said, we looked at 6 broad categories of environmental impact or dependency on natural capital. And the study showed that if you add up all of those impacts and dependencies and you put them in dollar terms and said how much does that actually mean to the global economy, how much does all this business activity create in terms of externalities, it's about 4.7 trillion for the top 100 externalities. So these are the top sectors that create the top environmental impacts or use the most resources in various different regions. What would they create? And 4.7 trillion, just to put that into context, is almost the same number as the combined losses of OECD pension funds in 2008 as a consequence of the global financial crisis. So it's a big number. And what do these externalities actually look like and where do they come from? Well, I've picked out the top 5 here. You can see if I focus on number 2, cattle ranching. You can see that in cattle ranching in South America, what we're examining there are the impact of the production of the cattle, the emissions, the methane emissions from the cattle. We're also looking at the land conversion, so the conversion of critical rainforest resources to, for the purposes of cattle ranching in South America. And if you add all that up and look at the economic consequence of that production of cattle in South America, it actually amounts to 19 times the revenue of the cattle ranching sector in South America. So if I put that really simply, if you're to buy a beef burger in South America or a beef burger using beef from South America, you should be paying 19 times the current price you're paying. So understanding that means that actually we can look at ways of optimizing for this, because this is the worst. What is the best? Is the best going to set us on a pathway of sustainable development? Can the planet sustain us, actually, and through that growth, 3 billion more middle-class consumers? This is the question we have to answer. So between the difference of the cattle ranching in South America and the place where it's the best, that's where our optimization opportunity lies. And for business people, that's where actually you can hedge your risk. That's where you can lower your costs. in the future. So I'll go on now to talk about the kind of work that leading businesses around the world are starting to do with respect to natural capital. There's a lot of work going on around accounting mechanisms and how you account for natural capital. And just to highlight a couple of areas, investors are becoming increasingly interested. We work for the top 3 pension funds in Europe on quantifying risk, and what these pension funds are really interested in is stranded assets. Where are investments being made today in assets that will be stranded, worthless, because of regulation, because of lack of access to resources like water, because of changes in pricing? And that's what's really concerning them. Because at the moment, if you have a look at the value of oil and gas companies, for example, one of 2 statements is incorrect that I'm about to make. One, the value of oil and gas companies is perfectly accurate, and we will be guaranteed to be on a pathway of a 6-degree warming for the planet, because if we dig up all the oil and burn it, then that is business as usual, and that sets us on a 6-degree pathway. And the value of those businesses is entirely founded on their ability to exploit all of those reserves. Or, statement number 2, the value of the oil and gas companies is entirely incorrect, because they can only dig up 20% of the oil and burn it if we are to be on a 2-degree warming pathway, which is where most scientific consensus says we need to be. So either the value, the market capitalization of oil and gas companies is correct, but we will have to deal with a much warmer planet, or, and water poverty and climate migrants, or the company's value in the long term is incorrect. So that's the fundamental conundrum that many major pension funds are having to deal with today. How do you actually translate that into near-term financial forecasting? There are other initiatives going on as well in terms of the various initiatives, corporations and governments, and I won't go through all of those just because of time. But what we have done, I'll just show you one case study here where we've worked with a business, Puma, footwear and apparel, and the CEO of Puma wanted to understand how much his business would be impacted if he had to pay for ecosystem services, if he had to pay for the natural capital for his business. And so, in short, what we did was we analyzed Puma, we analyzed the supply chain all the way back to the raw materials, all the way back to the cattle ranchers, and in fact all the way back to the wheat production that goes in as a food stock. And we found that if you add all of that up, and if you priced water as if it should be priced if it was scarce, then the total amount is 145 million euros, which is about half of Puma's profits. And we're doing this kind of analysis at a number of other businesses around the world. What that did was it showed them where the risk lies, and it actually showed them how to optimize that risk. So the next thing they did was they said, what we want to do is we want to create new products that have a lower risk profile and that are more environmentally friendly, that we can market to consumers, and that actually cost the same amount of money to make. So they have found ways of sourcing cotton and producing shoes with a lower environmental footprint, with less natural capital use, at the same price to the consumer. So this product here on the right-hand side is biodegradable. It uses organic cotton. It actually uses recycled solar panels, believe it or not, in the shoe. And if you add up per shoe the natural capital value of that shoe, it's €2.95. But a normal shoe would cost on average €4.29. So actually it's 30% better for the planet. But the important point is it's also the same cost to the consumer and the same margin to Puma. So really, I don't see what is not to like about that. That's a sustainable business model. This kind of analysis as well can also be applied at a project level. So we've worked in various other ways to look at what we would call net benefit. So if we assume that business as usual is not the pathway we want to be on, that we are not using the right lens to look at resource efficiency and how productive we can be, then we need to compare business as usual with alternatives, both in financial terms, so how much investment do I need to make for a better environmental technology, but also in natural capital terms. And so what we've done in the UK is we've looked at wood-based biomass plants and how they compare with the grid energy, but looking across a whole range of different factors, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also pollution and also land conversion and sequestration of carbon emissions. And if you compare the two, again, it's between 30 to 40% gain in environmental benefit of the wood-based biomass approach over the grid. And if you quantify that in financial terms, in this particular project, that's £20 million of benefit to the UK society for this plant being installed versus just using the grid, in lowered healthcare costs, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, reduced use of water, reduced other forms of pollution. And we've also been working with Veolia to help them help their clients look at water. So if you look at the bar chart on the left-hand side, if you're a finance director, if you ignore the blue part of those bars, if you're a finance director today, you would say, I want to invest in the project on the left. Why? Because if you add up the CapEx and the OpEx, the capital expenditure and the operating expenditure, that is a lower cost project than the one on the right. The one on the right-hand side delivers environmental benefits. It uses less water. It causes less pollution. But money is short, so I'm going to invest in the one on the right-hand side. Sorry, the one on the left-hand side. Because it has a lower lifetime cost. But that calculation does not factor in what would happen, for example, if you priced water. What happens if water were priced as if it were scarce? How does that change the calculation? Does that change the net present value calculation? So if you did that and you add in the blue bars, you suddenly see quite obviously that you would want to invest in the one on the right-hand side. It delivers environmental benefits, it has less risk, and over the lifespan of that project, which could be 20 years, it's going to deliver more savings for the business. So, in summary, we see risks and opportunities, as ever, in business. There are plenty of opportunities, though, and these are opportunities to identify where you can optimize your supply chain, where you can optimize your operations, where you can secure supply of materials that are less volatile. Sainsbury's in the UK has decided to enter into long-term contracts with growers of fruit in places where water is of less of a risk. Why? Because they think they'll be paying less in 4 years' time than their competition. Because the fruit for everybody else will go up in cost, while for them it will stay at the same price. So I think there are some really compelling reasons why businesses should be examining natural capital really carefully. I think it's a strategic issue. I think it will generate value in the near term as well as the long term. And I think that the businesses that recognize this and that can think about ways of transforming their business models will actually be more competitive and will be able to create and satisfy more demand, capture more of those 3 billion middle-class consumers that we expect to see in the next 20 years. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a Richard Mattison por esta interesantísima exposición sobre el capital natural en riesgo. Disponemos de 10 minutos para alguna pregunta, que no sé si de momento no me ha llegado ninguna a la mesa, pero disponemos de un tiempo adicional que, en todo caso, podríamos aprovechar para... Había un par de preguntas al honorable Gary Bardiner. Igual podíamos aprovechar para que en este pequeño tiempo que nos queda pues pueda contestarle a los que la han formulado. No sé si hay un micrófono inalámbrico que podamos utilizar para pasárselo en todo caso y responder a estas dos preguntas que le han formulado. Señor Gardiner está ahí. Thank you very much, Mr. Gardiner. The two questions about your speech.
Sure. I was given two questions. One was putting a price on things which presently businesses don't pay for creates economic interests against those presently dominant. How do countries deal with this? The other question was, how are these ecosystem services markets going to be applicable to companies, and what is the role of companies in this process? Well, I think Richard has very ably answered that second question. And it is very clear that companies actually are now taking a lead in this area ahead of governments, because they are recognizing precisely the risks to their own supply chains that ecosystem services failure represents. I thought it was very interesting that he mentioned in particular the example of Sainsbury's deciding to disinvest or to pull out of markets for oranges where there is potential for water shortage. Now, if that does not send a message to politicians in Spain about the importance of a proper valuation of the ecosystem services that water represents in Spain, then it really should do. And I thought it was a superb example. The first question is perhaps, although again I think has been very well answered in Richard's presentation, but it also I think has a political dimension to it. Because yes, this does create economic interests against those that are presently dominant in our countries. And how we deal with that is also a political question. But of course, nobody would suggest that it is not the role of government to regulate about the planning process. Everyone accepts that if you want to put up a factory, or if you want to put up an extension to your house, then there is a role for government, either nationally or locally, to decide whether what you are proposing is in society's wider benefit or not. And there are regulations which are brought to bear. They may be to do with land use, they may be zoning of land use, they may be for building materials that can be used, they may be about the rights of your neighbors to have light on their property. All of these are ways in which we accept that as a society we must regulate and control our development. And I find it quite extraordinary that some people question why it is that when one is using what have been regarded as externalities, when one is using public goods, yes, the forest may be privately owned, as was mentioned by one of our first speakers. Much forest is, both in the UK and I'm sure here in Spain. But the fact that it is a privately owned forest does not mean that it does not have public benefit which it gives to the wider community. And therefore it is equally appropriate that government should regulate to ensure that that public benefit, those public goods of soil stabilization, watershed protection, flood alleviation, are all captured and maintained. Yes, by all means allow the person who owns that forested land to make a development there, but not at the wider expense of the public goods which the rest of society depends on. So I do think this is a moral choice. It is something which we as a society do have to cope with. But I do find it strange when people suggest that somehow government should not be be able to regulate in this area when so clearly we do in many other areas that are similar? Leave it there.
Thank you very much, Honorable Harry Warner. Tres preguntas para Richard Mattison. La primera pregunta es, ¿cómo incorporar la contabilidad natural a compañías globales como las aéreas?
I think that much like any kind of analysis of strategy or risk or opportunity, you need to start with the measurement of the opportunity. So I think that what most companies do to begin with is they gather as much information about their activities and the range of activities they have. So what are they doing that is business as usual, and what are they doing that is different from business as usual? And so what that means is you have to quantify the environmental impact of your business. You have to quantify where you differ from your competition. And that's quite hard because actually that quantification can be complicated where you have to examine complex supply chains. And I'll go on to talk about that in the next question. But what global businesses that we work with are doing is using existing systems. So these are SAP and Oracle and Microsoft systems, using production information, and using all of that useful information that already exists and flows within businesses. Couple that with tools that are available in the marketplace and use that to analyze natural capital risks and opportunities. Because this is about harnessing data. Everybody is excited at the moment about big data and the opportunity big data has for business. Well, this is another type of big data. This is environmental big data. And our challenge is to harness that big data and really use it to identify opportunities. And so that's what big businesses are working a lot on at the moment that we work with.
Thank you, Richard. Next question. Relation between natural capital valuation and life cycle analysis. Relación entre el capital natural y el análisis de ciclo de vida.
Yeah, so life cycle analysis is a tool to analyze a product, usually, all along its life cycle. And actually, it's totally necessary to use these types of tools to conduct this type of analysis, because the very first step is understanding the impact along the whole life cycle of a product. If you have a look at the example I gave about Puma, if you just looked at Puma's operations, that's 6% of their overall impact. It's not any more than that, because their supply chain is quite complicated, and it's in the supply chain. That's where all the risk and opportunity lies. So life cycle analysis helps businesses understand these risks. And that's also a challenge, because as businesses have outsourced to markets the ability to generate goods and services at different points in the supply chain, the value chain, we've actually outsourced information. And all we ask for is price and quality. So the only two things that flow through the global economy are price and quality. The rest of the information about child labor, water scarcity, risks, we only know about quite often when it's too late. So life cycle analysis is one of those tools that we actually use quite a lot with clients, and I think is a very useful tool to understand the impact and dependency of a product along the whole value chain. And if you couple that with natural capital valuation, you can come up with some very, very interesting analysis. And we've used those kind of tools, for example, with a global carpet manufacturer to great effect.
Thank you, Richard. Tercera pregunta. Do you include risk eventual accidents with environmental consequences as part of your environmental impact appraisal, I suppose, for your client companies?
So if I understand the question correctly, I think that might be referring to things like maybe oil spills. That's actually, we didn't, in the analysis I showed for Puma, include risks as a consequence of oil spills. What we did include were risks as a consequence of a change in the availability of a resource because of events that can be created, like sort of droughts, if you like. So we did include some of those risks.
Another question, Richard. Se ha hablado de reducir el coste ambiental de algunos. Se ha hablado de reducir el coste ambiental de algunos productos como las zapatillas Puma, manteniendo el mismo precio al consumidor. La pregunta es, ¿no podría ser esto peligroso para que algunas compañías utilicen este margen mayor en el beneficio que le supone este ahorro para aumentar su producción de ese producto y de esta manera acabar por producir el mismo daño en el agotamiento de los recursos?
I think our challenge is twofold. We need to invent new solutions and mainstream those solutions, but also we need to incrementally, in the mass market of activity we have, change how we're doing things as well. So I actually don't mind if a company earns more money out of creating products that have less dependency on depleting natural resources, because that will be at the expense of the profit of their competition. And investors will recognize that and start to allocate capital to those companies that are doing that. So markets over time, and maybe this won't happen fast enough, and this is why you need regulation as well, but markets over time will correct for companies that are earning more profit out of using less to create more. So although on the face value of it, we shouldn't be encouraging that kind of behavior, I actually think that markets will reward companies that are more resource efficient, because the challenge that we have is to decouple growth in revenue and satisfied demand from our environmental impact and dependency on scarce and finite resources.
Gracias, Richard. La última pregunta, que no leo muy bien, pero creo que la persona que pregunta quiere preguntar cómo estima el precio de mercado para el agua en diferentes países y cómo se calcula, en particular, este precio de metro cúbico. ¿Cómo estima Trucost el precio del mercado para el agua en diferentes países y cómo está calculando el precio del metro cúbico del agua en Europa?
So water pricing is difficult, actually, when the market doesn't reflect the scarcity of water. So there are a number of different techniques to recognize what the price of water should be in areas where water is more scarce. And those techniques essentially reflect the value of the scarcity. These are tried and tested techniques in economic terms. So we use the total economic value framework. This is a framework that's been used for decades by economists to understand value. It takes into account the cost of infrastructure, which actually, normally speaking, is included in the price, but where water is heavily subsidized is not included in the price. And it also takes into account the indirect benefits of water provided by ecosystems, the provisioning effects, and also recreation. So, for example, well, first of all, what I should say is that in the example I gave with Puma, the analysis for water was localized. We didn't use a global number for water. It was very, very localized to the regions where they need cotton and they need leather and the cattle ranches are, and where they produce and the tanning factories and where the dyeing processes take place. So all of those things in terms of water availability and quality are local and that was reflected in the analysis, although that was quite challenging. But for other companies, like we've worked for water utility companies, where we've looked at things like the recreational, the tourism value of water. Because if you take away a lake, then actually you are taking away an amenity for people, and that amenity is worth something. If you have a beautiful woodland or a park, then the value of the housing around that park is actually higher. You take it away, the value goes down. Now, nobody's paying the park for that value, but the fact is the value is higher of the houses around the park. So we've worked with 2 water utility companies, actually, to really understand the value they're generating by sustainably managing their habitats and their ecosystems that they rely on. And in fact, one of them, we worked for the chief financial officer, and she used the analysis to go to their bank and lower the cost of lending for their business, which I thought was a very interesting approach and a very interesting use of this type of analysis.
Muchísimas gracias a Richard Mattison. Is there any other best practice with natural capital value? La pregunta es, leo, creo leer. Is there any other best practice to evaluate or natural capital value? Okay.
So what I should say is that for businesses interested in conducting this type of analysis, the TEEB for Business Coalition is, along with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, is capturing all of the best practices around valuing natural capital and documenting them and mapping those processes right now. So hopefully by the end of October, they will produce a study that shows what all the best practices are and why it is relevant to do this kind of analysis and how you do this kind of analysis for businesses. So if you're interested, I can pass on the contact details of the people there if you're interested in that.
Thank you very much, Richard Mattison. By the way, Richard, I know that today is your wedding anniversary, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Gracias. Nuestro siguiente orador, ponente, es el doctor Michael Jenkins, si es tan amable. Muy brevemente recordar, Michael Jenkins es consejero delegado el presidente y fundador de Forest Trend. Desde el año 1989 a 1999, él fue el director asociado del programa de sostenibilidad y seguridad global de la Fundación MacArthur. Las responsabilidades de Michael con el programa incluían el área de Latinoamérica y el Caribe y llevaba la gestión global del programa. En 1998, Michael fue, en designación conjunta, asesor de silvicultura o Montes senior del Banco Mundial. Antes de entrar en la Fundación MacArthur, trabajó 3 años como en agroforestería en Haití y en el programa de participación comunitaria de agroforestería de la agencia americana USAID, la agencia americana de cooperación. Previamente a todo esto, trabajó en el desarrollo en la organización y el desarrollo de diversos programas con Appropriate Technology International y como asesor técnico. Y al final de los años 70, Michael fue voluntario de Cuerpo de Paz en Paraguay, trabajando en el sector de la agricultura, de la apicultura y de los proyectos de montes. Ha viajado alrededor, por todas partes, en Latinoamérica, en Asia y en parte de África. Habla español, muy bien, por cierto, Michael, muy bien, español, castellano. Habla francés, habla portugués, habla guaraní y habla creol. Así que no cabe la menor duda que es persona que se preocupa y se interesa por la proximidad con las comunidades locales. Ha escrito muchísimos libros y artículos, uno de ellos de gran importancia para los que les interese la silvicultura sostenible, los negocios de la silvicultura sostenible, estrategias para una industria en transición. Michael ha estudiado en la Universidad de Yale, donde ha obtenido el título de doctor de máster en ciencias forestales. Y recientemente ha sido premiado por la Fundación Skoll con una distinción especial por emprendedor social. Muchas gracias, Michael, por tu presencia aquí y cuando quieras tienes la palabra.
Gracias, José María, y gracias a todos los que están organizando este evento aquí, y también a Barry y a Richard, que estamos juntos, qué buena cosa. Tiene mucho sentido que estamos aquí en el Instituto de Ingeniería, porque como hemos mencionado otros que estaban presentando, ellos son los que van a aplicar estas ideas. Hemos escuchado muchas lindas palabras de hoy, que es muy importante, pero ya estamos al punto de que tenemos que aplicarlo. Tenemos que tomar acción en vez de hablar de estos temas. No solamente es un asunto de hablar de estudios académicos, de valorización del medio ambiente, ecosistemas, pero es ya el momento de compensar, de buscar maneras de que podemos, en inglés nos dicen en Forest Trends, make the priceless valuable. Lo que es precioso tenemos que darle un valor real, si no lo vamos a perder. Y eso fue fundamentalmente el razón que comenzamos esta organización que se llama Forest Trends, y lo hicimos hace 15 años. Y lo que quiero hacer hoy, muy brevemente, es hablar un poco de una de las programas de Forest Trends que se llama el Ecosystem Marketplace, ¿no? Y la idea del Ecosystem Marketplace creció durante una reunión grande de Catumba, que es otro programa que tenemos aquí en Forest Trends. La idea fue de Catumba de traer juntos todas las personas que estaban trabajando en este asunto de mercados o pagos de sistemas ecosistémicos, de valores de ellos. Y en 2004... En 2004 lanzamos el Ecosystem Marketplace, y en este momento la idea fue de crear el Bloomberg de Environmental Services. Hemos escuchado también hoy, esta mañana, muchos comentarios de que no tenemos datos, no sabemos el valor de esto. Y para nosotros fue fundamental tratar de empezar a reunir todos los datos que tenemos para empujar un poco más de ese asunto. Fundamental para un mercado son transacciones. Fundamental para transacciones es información transparente. Así, Bloomberg forma el base de los diferentes mercados que tenemos de finanzas. Platts es otro ejemplo de una plataforma de información que fue fundamental para el mercado de petróleo. Así lo que queremos hacer es otra vez tratar de crear esa plataforma de información para servicios ambientales, para los mercados que ya están saliendo. Y aquí solamente tenemos algunas fechas que son parte del crecimiento del Ecosystem Marketplace, donde sacamos el primer estudio a nivel global de carbono voluntario, de agua, de biodiversidad, para mostrarles que estamos ya detrás de todos estos diferentes tipos de mercado, tratando de demostrar que hay datos, que hay experiencia, y con eso sí podemos seguir adelante. Aquí otra vez la idea de tratar de formar una fuente mundial de noticias, de datos, de análisis sobre el amplio rango de diferentes mercados ambientales y para pagos de servicios ambientales. De nuestra perspectiva es súper importante que siempre tomamos en cuenta de que estos diferentes instrumentos, estos diferentes servicios tienen una conexión fundamental. No solamente la conexión cuando estás mirando allá en la tierra o en el monte, la relación entre agua, bosques, biodiversidad, pero también cuando estamos hablando de mercados, de la formación de mercados, porque hay instrumentos que, por ejemplo, en el caso de carbono, que son importantísimos cuando estamos hablando de formar diferentes instrumentos para biodiversidad, para agua. Así, fundamental que pensamos que estos actúan juntamente. Empezando con biodiversidad, y quiero reforzar algunas cosas que hemos mencionado hoy. Primero es buenísimo que aquí en España están ya listos para lanzar un nuevo ley. La relación entre reglamento y también de movimiento del mercado es fundamental, muy delicado, pero sí conectado. Así va a ser importante para el futuro del valor de biodiversidad aquí en España. Pero también quería mostrar un poco de la escala. La razón que estamos ya en el camino de buscar mercados, yo no soy economista, no soy tipo que busca el mercado para todo, soy ingeniero forestal, me encantan los bosques. Pero la experiencia que tengo es que todas las soluciones que hemos buscado en los últimos 30 años, 50 años, 100 años, no llegan a la escala que necesitamos. Por eso las herramientas de mercados, de pagamientos, yo creo que sí nos van a servir para llegar a la escala que necesitamos. Aquí solamente para mostrar que la estima es que 78 mil millones de dólares es el valor perdido de la biodiversidad. Y en ese momento tenemos más o menos 4 mil millones, algo así que va a un nivel global para biodiversidad. Las escalas son completamente diferentes, por eso tenemos que ampliar el trabajo para llegar a esta escala. Aquí estamos hablando de bancos de conservación, que un instrumento, solamente uno de los instrumentos cuando estamos hablando de biodiversity, pero fundamental. Y se ve aquí que es un mercado que tiene más o menos 25 años, es joven todavía, pero sí tiene un valor, 4 mil millones de dólares estimadamente por todo el mundo. Ahora lo que vemos con este slide aquí es que casi todos los bancos de conservación están en los Estados Unidos. Casi toda la biodiversidad del mundo está fuera de los Estados Unidos. Así no tenemos una conexión muy buena. La próxima etapa es que tenemos que tomar esos diferentes instrumentos como bancos de conservación y aplicarlos a los lugares donde se necesitan. Madagascar, Perú, México, todos los lugares donde tenemos una abundancia de biodiversidad, pero no tenemos estos instrumentos. Ahí en el Ecosystem Marketplace tratamos de hacer a lo menos 3 diferentes cosas. En realidad son 4. Primero es con noticias. Tenemos un site que se llama Species Banking y es un sitio web donde tenemos todas las noticias actuales, todas las transacciones, ahí punto a punto. Así otra vez, en vez de decir, ¿cómo vamos a hacerlo? No sabemos el valor. Sí estamos ya empezando a tener valores reales con experiencia. Hacemos también un reporte anual del estado de biodiversidad, de pagos para biodiversidad, para otra vez tratar de comunicarlo bien. Y la analítica para nosotros también es fundamental de con estos datos que estamos aprendiendo. Y tenemos en biodiversidad y también en carbono y agua un portal donde podemos todos los diferentes proyectos. Así pueden ir al portal y decir qué están haciendo ahí en Colombia y qué es, así otra vez de tener esa información en una manera muy transparente. Mencionó también Barry esta mañana de que hay muchos avances ahora en Inglaterra. Y nosotros parte del trabajo en biodiversidad el año pasado lanzamos el primer standard para biodiversity offsets. Así hay la mejor práctica en biodiversity offsets para tener un standard a un nivel global. Eso también otro mecanismo que nos ayuda para llegar a la escala. Con ese standard ya todas las empresas pueden decir, así lo debo hacer. Y con mucho detrás del estándar tenemos muchas diferentes herramientas para ayudar a empresas, para ayudar a comunidades, para ayudar a gobiernos para implementar este tipo de herramienta. Ahora cambiando un poco para el asunto de agua y Richard nos habló un poco de agua también hoy. Y todos así conocemos que agua va a ser un asunto fundamental. Ya con más y más personas y menos agua vamos a tener un crisis. Ya hemos tenido un crisis para 50 años, pero el crisis va creciendo y creciendo. El valor de agua va a ser muy importante. Seguro aquí en España ustedes lo conocen bien, ¿eh? Y una manera de pensar de agua otra vez es los costos de infraestructura y pagos incentivos para inversiones en servicios de cuentas hidrológicos, que son para mí la infraestructura natural. Eso es el parte fundamental, que tiene un valor muy pequeño cuando estamos pensando de los diferentes maneras de tratar de combatir el problema de agua. Y otra vez es un asunto fundamental que los ingenieros tienen que trabajar con nosotros. Ellos son los que deciden que vamos a poner este tipo de empresa, que vamos a construirlo. Y cuando ves a un nivel global el tamaño de plata que vamos a tener que usar para llegar a para invertir en el asunto de la infraestructura para agua, es $1,000 millones hasta hoy y 2030. $1,000 millones. Así es algo bastante grande. Cuando ves los otros diferentes caminos también y otras cosas, va a ser una inversión enorme en el asunto de agua. El pequeño círculo en negro es la cantidad de plata que estamos invirtiendo ahora en esa infraestructura natural, los bosques, los diferentes ecosistemas que nos están dando el servicio de agua, de calidad de agua y de cantidad de agua. Sí se ve que es un punto en términos de toda la inversión. Y la razón es que los ingenieros que salen de aquí piensan de gray solutions, piensan de concreto para sacar, para tratar con agua. No piensan de la naturaleza que nos ha dado ese servicio para miles de años, ¿no? Y aquí solamente todos seguro que lo conocen, pero este es el caso clásico de inversiones en cuencas hidroeléctricas y el papel que puede tocar esa infraestructura natural, pero todavía no ha llegado a ser parte de las herramientas que los ingenieros usan, ni tampoco que los ministerios de financiamiento entienden cuando están tomando esas decisiones de cómo combatir el problema de agua. Aquí, hicimos un reporte global que salió este año, otra vez buscando todas las diferentes transacciones de servicios hidrológicos, todos los programas que podemos decir, esto es infraestructura natural, esto es donde la inversión. Y se ve muy claramente que China tiene un gran porcentaje de eso. Ellos tienen un problema de agua, todos lo conocen. Y están buscando maneras más eficientes para tratar con ese problema de agua. Los Estados Unidos también tienen, y vemos que hay programas en todas partes del mundo. Pero otra vez, $8,000 millones en frente de $1,000 millones. Un porcentaje muy, muy poco en términos de aprovechar lo que tenemos. Con otros beneficios para biodiversidad, beneficios para comunidades, beneficios para bosques. Pero no entra en el argumento cuando estamos pensando de que el futuro de agua en España, el futuro de agua en China. Este punto no entra hasta ahora. Aquí pensamos otra vez necesidades de información en etapa de rendición de cuencas. Y tenemos que, como estaba diciendo Richard antes, ¿no? Estamos en una etapa fundamental donde tenemos que entender un poco mejor los valores, los costos, para decir que este proyecto para invertir en el bosque te va a salir mejor que crear otro tipo de empresa más tradicional, ¿no? De transportar agua de ahí por acá, lo que sea, ¿no? Y estamos ahí en la posición de tratar de evaluar las herramientas y los supuestos y estructuras de contratos y resultados. Cambiando al otro grande servicio es carbono, y todos sabemos que estamos tratando de crear mecanismos a un nivel global. No hemos tenido éxito hasta ahora. Por eso seguimos perdiendo muchas hectáreas de bosques y otros ecosistemas, y 5 millones por año a lo menos, y con emisiones que suben todavía. Y para mí lo fundamental es el papel de bosques en esto, ¿no? Y casi 30% de las emisiones que van a la atmósfera salen de bosques, de bosques que estamos quemando, bosques que estamos convirtiendo para agricultura, lo que sea. Así es el problema más grande cuando estamos hablando o el segundo más grande cuando estamos hablando de emisiones. Pero al mismo tiempo, al otro lado es la oportunidad más grande, porque es claro que es la manera que podemos convertir eso. Con land use, con bosques, ya tenemos la oportunidad de bajar la pérdida de bosques y las emisiones que se van a la atmósfera. Otra vez una oportunidad muy grande, todavía no la hemos logrado porque no podemos, somos seres humanos, parece que no podemos juntarnos de una mente para decir que tenemos que trabajar sobre este problema. Espero que no sea la realidad, pero esto ya es la experiencia. Nosotros con el Ecosystem Marketplace ya estamos reportando cada año en diferentes aspectos de carbono, voluntary carbon, el mercado voluntario, al mismo tiempo el mercado de bosques con carbono. Y esto es un análisis que tenemos de las diferentes inversiones que que hemos visto aquí en el mercado voluntario. Se ve muy claro que bosques y uso de suelo es central para esto. Y también mencionó, creo que fue Barry en una de las preguntas, pero lo interesante del mercado voluntario es que es un mercado que no tiene reglamento. Entonces son acciones voluntarias de empresas que quieren decir, queremos liderar este movimiento, porque en realidad no hemos tenido éxito en términos de reglamentos. Así el papel de las empresas es fundamental y es bueno que tenemos algunas empresas con nosotros aquí hoy, porque su papel es fundamental cuando no tenemos liderazgo en términos del gobierno a nivel global. Aquí otra vez, solamente para darnos una idea de la escala, ¿no? Tenemos ahora las necesidades que estamos pensando de los proyectos para carbono forestal, es más o menos 2.000 millones de dólares. Pero la realidad es que el financiamiento que va a ser necesario para reducir la deforestación para 2020, para 50%, sería 300.000 millones de dólares. Así estamos hablando de escalas que son completamente desconectadas. Y eso es razón que seguimos buscando maneras como mercados que nos van a ayudar, espero, que nos van a ayudar para llegar a esa escala. Y como estuvimos hablando Richard y Barry también, la plata que necesitamos para reducir deforestación. Al otro lado, el valor de los hectáreas que estamos deforestando es otra vez miles de dólares. Aquí es una mapa global donde tratamos de mapear dónde están las soluciones. Se ve en el gris es hotspots. Eso es los hotspots de forestal. El verde es los dólares, miles de dólares apoyado a la conservación forestal por compensación privada. El rojo es los miles de millones de dólares comprometidos por financiamiento de RED. No sé si todos entienden RED. Esto es Reduced Emissions for Deforestation and Degradation. Es un programa hace 3-4 años ya de donaciones de agencias públicas, Norway, Inglaterra, Alemania, para reducir emisiones, para investir en bosques. Y el rojo más oscuro, vamos a decir, son los dólares que ya han llegado al donde estaban. Así tenemos otro problema muy grande, que es gobiernos que prometen para invertir plata, pero esa plata no sale de sus ahorros para llegar al bosque donde debe de estar. Otro pequeño problema que tenemos a nivel mundial. Otra parte de cuando estamos hablando de carbono y el futuro de carbono y las oportunidades, estamos viendo hasta que hemos perdido, voy a decir, hasta ahora la oportunidad de crear un acuerdo global para combatir carbono. Sí estamos viendo algunos diferentes movimientos que son bastante interesantes. Y lo estamos hablando de políticas climáticas nacionales o domesticados. Y se ve que South Korea, Thailand, South Africa, Chile, Costa Rica, a nivel nacional, a nivel estadual o provincial, se ve que hay movimiento ahora en China y en los Estados Unidos, en California, donde están formando programas regulados a ese nivel que va a empujar el mercado. Así todavía tenemos esperanza de que hay diferentes herramientas que podemos utilizar para tratar de crear la regulación que es fundamental cuando estamos pensando de escala. Programas voluntarios son muy, muy importantes para crear innovación, para mostrar cómo lo hacemos, pero llegar a una escala tenemos que tener un mercado regulado. Así, regulación es muy fundamental. Y espero que España en algún momento piensa bien de las oportunidades con red, de las oportunidades de carbono y piensa un poco de las oportunidades de crear un reglamento que podría ser a un nivel nacional para empujar esos mercados. Si no, la realidad es que todas las inversiones van a ser a una escala otra vez bastante pequeña si no tenemos esta regulación. Solamente para mostrar algunas de las necesidades de información cuando estamos hablando de carbono otra vez. Y tenemos mucho más información en el Ecosystem Marketplace para los que quieren. Y quería mencionar también otro producto que salió este año que estamos llamando el Valorando Naturaleza. La idea es de crear el Ecosystem Marketplace en español para toda Latinoamérica. Y sería muy interesante si España sería interesado en esto, ¿no? Siendo parte ibérico y la historia que España tiene con estos diferentes países. Y algunos comentarios que quería, con esto voy a terminar, pero que sí quería hacer algunos comentarios a un nivel un poco más amplio. Primero es que todos los mercados que vemos ahora y tengo una matriz allá afuera que marca los 25 diferentes tipos de mercados para servicios ecosistemas. Todos son bastante jóvenes, son novedades, ¿no? Carbono también esto no ha arrancado completamente. Pero de todos modos nos dan una idea de las diferentes oportunidades que necesitan. Como mencioné ya, es fundamental para que estos mercados lleguen a una escala grande, que hay ese baile entre acción voluntario, lo liderazgo que vemos de empresas, de otras cosas, con reglamento. Sin reglamento, voluntad, energía de acción voluntaria nunca va a llegar a la escala que necesitamos. Tenemos también la necesidad de tratar de buscar maneras de coordinar la inversión privado, de inversiones privadas con el sector público también. Todos hablan de eso, pero ya es la hora para empezar a buscar diferentes puntos donde la inversión pública puede ayudar que el sector privado entre en estos diferentes mercados. Y hay bastantes diferentes experiencias con esto. Otro punto es, como ves en el matriz, y una cosa que he enfocado es que hay una convergencia entre estos diferentes mercados. No vamos a solucionar nuestros problemas de ecosistemas si creamos solamente un mercado de carbón, si creamos solamente un mercado de agua o si creamos un mercado de biodiversidad. Nunca vamos a llegar a donde tenemos que llegar. Así tenemos que empezar a pensar de cómo, y más que pensar, pero promover proyectos que muestran cómo estos diferentes servicios actúan juntos. No solamente ahí en el landscape, pero también cómo pueden actuar juntos en el mercado. Y finalmente, estamos en un punto de que tenemos que tener mucha fuerza en lo que queremos hacer. Tenemos que crear la escala que necesitamos, que tenemos que actuar con valor, arrestar que esto es algo que podemos ir adelante. Así no es un asunto de paso a paso y vamos con cuidado. Estamos perdiendo en la guerra con esto. Tenemos que actuar ya con mucho más fuerza, con valor, para estar que podemos hacer algo en esto. Bueno, gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a Michael Jenkins por esta interesantísima exposición y no cabe la menor duda que haremos todo lo posible, al menos algunos, para impulsar los mercados de los servicios de los ecosistemas en los que creemos firmemente que son una gran oportunidad para el país. No solamente para conservar nuestra naturaleza, sino para hacer infraestructura verde y especialmente, que tanto necesitamos en España, para los puestos de trabajo. Estamos seguros que los mercados ayudarán a ello. Michael, tenemos dos preguntas. Una está en castellano, otra en inglés, que a pesar de mi buen inglés no soy capaz de leer muy bien, pero creo que sé quién ha sido el autor o quién es el autor de la pregunta, al que luego le pediré que la formule verbalmente, porque no entiendo muy bien la letra. ¿Qué opina sobre la creación de un céntimo forestal sobre los hidrocarburos que causan los gases de efecto invernadero y con destino a un fondo forestal para los bosques que almacenen carbono?
La pregunta es solamente qué es mi opinión, no qué vamos a hacer de eso.
No, tu opinión.
No, la opinión es, en relación es muy claro para nosotros el cambio climático. Estamos en los Estados Unidos. Tengo muchas relaciones con el Forest Service allí y las personas que estaba encargado del Forest Service, trabajamos juntos con ellos muy cerca para algunos años. Y en algún momento, hace 3 años por ahí, ella me comentó de que nuestro budget para el Forest Service nunca crece año por año. Pero el problema es que está ahora gastando todos del budget del Forest Service combatiendo los fuegos que tenemos, que son más y más frecuentes y más fuerte en los Estados Unidos. Así ellos ya vieron hace como 5 años, 6 años este problema, que es cada año más dramático, que por alguna razón todos saben que el cambio climático está empujando más fuegos en Rusia, en los Estados Unidos, en Canadá, en México, en los lugares. Pero el público al otro mano no está dando los recursos necesarios para convertir esto, ni buscar maneras, diferentes mecanismos para tratar de apoyar eso.
Muchas gracias.
Trucost in Spain, and had the privilege of working with David Tepper, who is one of your public-private forest trends. My question is this week, The Economist wrote a very useful special report on biodiversity, in which it outlines how humankind has been probably responsible for the 6th greatest extinction and impacts from biodiversity that have gone on over the last 100 years. However, The Economist says that as we get richer, we will take more care of, and that'll be great for the future of biodiversity on the planet. So apparently 3 million new middle-class people is a good thing for biodiversity, according to The Economist. And I was wondering, Michael, if you ascribe to that belief or if you have a different view.
Well, it's wonderful that The Economist is covering these issues. That's really important. But I would have a different view on that. And part of it is, you're right that where we have done well historically with biodiversity has been where there is the resource to be able to manage it, on the one hand. Or where we've done well with biodiversity is where there has been no development. In other words, so the really remote areas of the world, the really poor areas of the world, the areas where you have great cultural diversity, that's where you find biodiversity. So again, it's kind of where this plays out. I would also argue with them that you have to think about the true impacts of those 3 billion middle-class people. And what we see on the landscape is really a collision that's happening between what I would say would be ecosystem functions, forests being a great example of that, up against a need for increased food production, food security, up against energy needs. And if you think about, you play that forward, it gets very difficult to figure out how you balance those different needs. It's hard for a forester to argue against somebody who is a food security expert, saying, how can you say we can't grow more wheat here? That's just a trade-off that's very hard to do. And if we are successful at moving away from a carbon-based economy, a lot of that pressure will again be on that same landscape to produce that energy in terms of biofuels or whatever they are. So it's really, I don't see it in sort of wealth or not wealth. I see it, another lens to think about it is, here's one planet. Here's a limited amount of space we have on this planet. And we're going to be 10 billion people, we're going to be 3 billion more middle-class people. How are we going to rationalize those challenges between those different interests? And right now, what happens is that the trade-off is somebody wins, somebody loses. And I think we have to find ways that they all come out with what we need. But it's not going to be simple. And I don't think it's just a matter of that idea of new middle-class folks that are going to care about biodiversity and therefore we're going to save it.
Muchísimas gracias a Michael Jenkins. Y con estas preguntas finalizamos su tiempo de exposición. Muchísimas gracias, Michael.